At 3:47 a.m. on November 8, 1983, Elena Volkov was 3 hours into her shift at RAF Menwith Hill, a NATO signals intelligence facility in northern England. She was listening to routine Soviet military communications. Standard protocol. Nothing unusual. Then frequency 7.625 MHz crackled to life. Two voices. Speaking in Russian. But these weren't ordinary Soviet officers. One voice belonged to General Yuri Volkin, deputy commander of the Soviet Strategic Rocket Forces. The other voice made Elena's blood freeze. It was Oleg Gordievsky, a high-ranking KGB colonel. Except Gordievsky wasn't just KGB. He was also a British double agent, one of the West's most valuable intelligence assets. And in that 3-minute conversation, Elena heard something that wasn't supposed to exist. A plan. A Soviet first-strike nuclear scenario. Targeting coordinates for Western cities. Launch timelines. Authorization protocols. But there was something else in that conversation. Something that didn't make sense. Gordievsky was feeding the general false information. Manipulating him. Setting up a scenario that would make the Soviets believe NATO was preparing to attack. Which would trigger a Soviet preemptive strike. Which would start World War III. Elena sat frozen, her hand hovering over the recording button. If she reported this, Gordievsky would be exposed and executed. Britain would lose its most valuable spy. But if she stayed silent, millions of people could die. She had 90 seconds to decide. This is the true story of what happened when one woman discovered that sometimes the greatest act of treason is loyalty. Elena Volkov wasn't supposed to be at Menwith Hill. She was supposed to be teaching Russian literature at Cambridge. That was the plan when she graduated top of her class in 1979. But her father had other ideas. Dmitry Volkov had defected from the Soviet Union in 1968. He'd been a translator for the Soviet embassy in London before he realized he couldn't go back to a country that imprisoned people for thinking differently. When he defected, he left behind his entire family. His parents. His sister. Everyone he'd ever known. The KGB made sure he understood the cost. His mother died in a gulag. His father vanished. The British gave Dmitry asylum, a new identity, and eventually a position at GCHQ, the government communications headquarters. He taught his daughter Russian the way other fathers teach their children to ride bikes. By the time Elena was 12, she spoke like a native Muscovite. She could identify regional dialects, military terminology, coded language. Her father called it a gift. Elena called it a burden. She didn't want to be a spy. She wanted to study Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. She wanted a quiet life far from the paranoia and secrets that had consumed her father. But in 1982, when British intelligence needed translators who could handle sophisticated Soviet communications, her father volunteered her name. He told her it was her duty. That she owed it to the country that had saved him. That her language skills could save lives. Elena agreed to 1 year. Just 12 months of service, then back to her academic career. She'd been at Menwith Hill for 14 months when she intercepted the conversation that would change everything. The facility itself was unlike anything most people imagine when they think of spy work. No glamorous agents in tuxedos. No car chases. Just rows of analysts wearing headphones, listening to endless hours of radio traffic. Most of it was boring. Weather reports. Supply requisitions. Soldiers complaining about the cold. But buried in that mountain of mundane communication were occasional gems. Intelligence that could shift the balance of power. Elena had developed an instinct for it. She could hear when something mattered. That night, she heard it in General Fokin's voice. Tension. Urgency. And something else. Fear. Elena rewound the tape 3 times to make sure she'd heard correctly. The conversation lasted 2 minutes and 47 seconds. But those 2 minutes contained enough information to rewrite everything Western intelligence thought they knew about Soviet nuclear strategy. General Volkin was discussing Operation Vryn, a real Soviet intelligence program designed to detect signs of a NATO nuclear first strike. But Gordievsky, the supposed British asset, was feeding him false indicators. Satellite photos that had been doctored. Radio intercepts that had been fabricated. Intelligence reports that painted a picture of NATO preparing for nuclear war. The evidence was convincing because it was designed to be convincing. Someone on the British side was creating it. Someone with access to classified NATO intelligence. Someone who wanted the Soviets to believe they were about to be attacked. And if the Soviets believed that, Soviet doctrine was clear. They would strike first. The entire conversation was a setup. But a setup for what? And by whom? Elena's training took over. She documented everything. Timestamps. Voice prints. Every word transcribed in English and Russian. Then she faced the moment that defined everything that came next. Standard protocol was clear. All intercepted communications went up the chain of command. Her supervisor would review it. Then his supervisor. Then intelligence analysts. Then, eventually, someone would decide what to do with it. But this wasn't standard intelligence. If Elena sent this up the chain, 2 things would happen immediately. First, Gordievsky would be exposed. The Soviets would know they had a mole in the KGB. He'd be arrested, interrogated, and executed. Second, whoever was manipulating him from the British side would know their operation had been discovered. They'd destroy evidence. Cover their tracks. Disappear. And the nuclear scenario they were orchestrating would continue under a different cover. Elena had another option. She could take the recording and go to someone outside the normal chain of command. Someone she could trust. But who? Her father worked for GCHQ. He knew people. He could help her figure out who to trust. But the moment she involved him, she was breaking protocol. Violating her security clearance. Committing what technically qualified as espionage against her own government. She sat in that surveillance room for 23 minutes, the recording on her desk, knowing that every second she delayed could matter. Finally, she made her choice. She didn't report it. She removed the tape from the recorder, labeled it "equipment malfunction," and put it in her bag. Then she finished her shift as if nothing had happened. 6 hours later, she was sitting in her father's kitchen, playing him the recording that would destroy both their lives. Dmitry Volkov listened to the recording twice without saying a word. When it finished the second time, he sat back in his chair and closed his eyes. Elena watched her father age 10 years in 10 seconds. He asked her 3 questions. First, had she told anyone else? No. Second, was the recording the only copy? Yes. Third, was she absolutely certain about the voice identification? Absolutely. Then he told her something that made her understand how deep the problem went. 3 months earlier, Dmitry had been approached by an old colleague from his GCHQ days. A man named Peter Ashford, who now worked in a classified capacity at MI6. Ashford had asked Dmitry strange questions about Soviet nuclear protocols. About how long it would take Soviet leadership to authorize a retaliatory strike. About what evidence would convince them that NATO was planning a first strike. At the time, Dmitry thought Ashford was working on contingency planning. Standard Cold War scenario modeling. But now, hearing the recording, he understood. Ashford was one of them. One of the people orchestrating the false intelligence operation. But why? Why would British intelligence want to trigger a Soviet nuclear strike? The answer, when Dmitry finally spoke it aloud, was more terrifying than the plan itself. There was a faction within Western intelligence that believed the Cold War couldn't end peacefully. That the Soviet Union would never collapse on its own. That the only way to win was through confrontation. They wanted a crisis. A nuclear standoff that would force the Soviets to either back down completely or be destroyed in a war they couldn't win. It was called the Endgame Protocol. Dmitry had heard rumors about it for years but never believed they were real. The idea was insane. Playing nuclear chicken with the survival of humanity. But the recording proved it was real. And if Operation VRYN succeeded, if the Soviets believed NATO was about to strike, they would launch their missiles. NATO would retaliate. Millions would die in the first hours. Billions in the nuclear winter that followed. Elena asked the question that mattered most. What do we do? Dmitry's answer was not what she expected. He said they had to warn the Soviets. Not through official channels. Those were compromised. But directly. Through back channels that still existed between former Soviet intelligence officers and Western assets who wanted to prevent war. It meant committing treason. Real treason. Not the procedural violation of removing a tape from work. But actively working against their own government to help the enemy. Elena asked if there was any other way. Her father shook his head. Then he said something Elena would remember for the rest of her life. He said, when your government is wrong, patriotism means betraying it. 24 hours later, Elena and her father met with a man named Viktor Kozlov in a pub in Edinburgh. Kozlov was GRU, Soviet military intelligence. He was also pragmatic enough to understand that nuclear war served no one's interests. He listened to the recording. Then he made a phone call. Within 48 hours, the situation escalated beyond anything Elena or her father had imagined. The recording reached someone in Soviet leadership with enough authority to investigate. Quietly. Carefully. Without alerting anyone who might be involved in the provocation. What they discovered confirmed everything. The doctored satellite photos. The fabricated radio intercepts. The false intelligence reports. All of it traced back to a small unit within MI6 called the Strategic Initiatives Group. 7 people. 3 from MI6. 2 from CIA. 2 from NATO intelligence. All of them believers in the Endgame Protocol. All of them convinced that forcing a nuclear confrontation was the only way to end the Cold War on Western terms. Soviet leadership made a calculation. If they exposed the plot publicly, it would cause a diplomatic crisis. NATO would deny everything. The warmongers would be temporarily sidelined but not eliminated. And the conspiracy would simply resurface under a different name. But there was another option. A quieter solution. The Soviets sent a message through Viktor Kozlov. They would allow the Endgame Protocol to continue. But they would feed it false information. Make the conspirators believe their plan was working. Lead them into a trap where they could be exposed and neutralized without creating an international incident. It was elegant. Dangerous. And it required Elena's cooperation. They needed her to remain at Menwith Hill. To continue intercepting communications. To feed them real-time intelligence about what the Strategic Initiatives Group was planning. Elena would become a double agent. Working for the Soviets against a rogue faction in her own government. But here's what made it impossible. The Soviets' plan required time. Weeks. Maybe months. And during that time, there would be moments when the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. Moments when Soviet missile crews would have their fingers on launch buttons, waiting for orders. Moments when one miscommunication, one technical failure, one nervous officer could end civilization. Kozlov promised they would maintain control. That Soviet leadership was committed to preventing war. But Elena knew how these things worked. She'd studied history. She knew about Stanislav Petrov, the Soviet officer who had prevented nuclear war in 1983 by refusing to report a false alarm. She knew how close the world had come to annihilation because of accidents, misunderstandings, computer errors. And now she was being asked to participate in a plan that would create those exact conditions deliberately. Her father told her to refuse. To find another way. But there was no other way. If she refused, the Soviets would expose what they knew. Elena would be arrested for espionage. Her father would be implicated. And the Strategic Initiatives Group would simply regroup and try again with better operational security. The only option that saved lives was the one that risked everything. Elena agreed. But she made one demand. If at any point the situation became unstable, if she believed nuclear war was imminent, she reserved the right to break cover and blow the whistle publicly. Consequences be damned. Kozlov agreed. He probably thought she'd never need to use that option. He was wrong. For 6 weeks, Elena lived 2 lives. During her shifts at Menwith Hill, she intercepted communications as always. But now she was looking for specific intelligence. Anything related to Operation VRYN. Anything that indicated the Strategic Initiatives Group was moving forward with their provocation. She found it. Radio traffic showing NATO forces moving into unusual positions near the Soviet border. Military exercises scheduled with suspicious timing. Intelligence reports being fed to Soviet channels that suggested NATO nuclear forces were at elevated readiness. All of it was theater. Carefully choreographed to convince Soviet intelligence that an attack was imminent. But the Soviets knew it was theater. They were playing along, feeding their own false information back through the system. Making the conspirators believe their plan was working. It was the most dangerous game of poker ever played. With nuclear weapons as the stakes. The crisis point came on December 2, 1983. Elena intercepted a communication between 2 Strategic Initiatives Group members. They were discussing the trigger event. A planned incident that would push Soviet paranoia past the breaking point. Force them to either launch a preemptive strike or back down completely. The incident was scheduled for December 15, less than 2 weeks away. Elena passed the information to Kozlov immediately. But when she met him 3 days later, his face told her everything she needed to know. Something had gone wrong. Soviet leadership was divided. The hardliners wanted to use the December 15 incident as justification for their own first strike. Take advantage of the provocation to settle the Cold War permanently. The moderates were arguing for restraint. But the debate was escalating. And the Soviet premier, who had the final say, was reportedly considering the hardline position. Kozlov told Elena that the plan had failed. The attempt to trap and neutralize the conspirators had instead created exactly the crisis they'd been trying to prevent. Soviet missile forces were being brought to full alert status. Not as theater. As actual preparation for nuclear war. The margin between performance and reality had disappeared. And on December 15, when the trigger event happened, there was a real possibility that Soviet leadership would interpret it as the beginning of a NATO first strike and launch everything they had. Elena asked what the trigger event was. Kozlov told her. And Elena realized that millions of people were going to die unless she did something that would destroy her father, end her own life as she knew it, and probably wouldn't even work. She had 8 days to stop World War III. Elena made her decision on December 7, 1983. She contacted the BBC. Not through official channels. Not through her chain of command. She called the newsroom directly and told them she had evidence of a conspiracy within British intelligence to provoke nuclear war with the Soviet Union. They thought she was insane. Until she offered to provide documentation. Recordings. Names. Dates. Evidence that could be verified independently. The BBC assigned their most experienced investigative journalist to meet with her. His name was Martin Shaw, and he'd covered intelligence stories for 20 years. He knew when someone was credible. Elena was credible. Shaw spent 3 days verifying everything she gave him. He contacted sources within NATO. Intelligence analysts. Military officials who could confirm that the troop movements and exercises were unusual. He even managed to reach a mid-level CIA officer who privately confirmed that a faction within Western intelligence was playing with fire. On December 12, 3 days before the trigger event, the BBC prepared to run the story. But they made a critical decision. Instead of broadcasting it immediately, they sent advance copies to Soviet leadership, NATO command, and the British Prime Minister with a 24-hour warning. The message was clear: this story is running. You have 1 day to prevent a nuclear incident. The response was immediate. The Strategic Initiatives Group was disbanded within hours. Peter Ashford and 2 others were arrested. The remaining 4 disappeared into early retirement with destroyed careers and no public explanation. The December 15th trigger event was quietly cancelled. NATO issued a statement about adjusting military exercises for weather concerns. The Soviets stood down their alert status. And the world never knew how close it had come. But there were consequences. Elena was arrested and charged with violating the Official Secrets Act. Her father was investigated but never charged. The evidence was overwhelming. Elena had removed classified materials, shared them with foreign intelligence, conspired with Soviet agents. There was no defense except the truth. And the truth was classified. Her trial lasted 3 days. The government presented its case in closed session. Elena wasn't allowed to call witnesses or present most of her evidence. The judge had no choice but to convict based on the law. But then something unexpected happened. During sentencing, the judge made a statement that became famous in legal circles. He said Elena Volkov had committed acts that technically qualified as treason. But that those acts had prevented a catastrophe that would have killed millions. He said the law and justice were sometimes in conflict. And when they were, judges had to make impossible choices. He sentenced Elena to 5 years in prison. Then he suspended the entire sentence. She walked out of the courtroom a free woman. The government appealed. The appellate court upheld the suspension. Elena never spent a day in jail. But her career was over. Her security clearance was revoked. She was unemployable in any government capacity. She eventually became a translator for the United Nations. Quiet work. Important work. Work that let her sleep at night. Her father died in 1991, 2 years after the Berlin Wall fell. He never spoke publicly about what happened. But in private, he told Elena he was proud of her. That she'd done what he'd been too afraid to do when he was her age. That choosing truth over loyalty was the hardest thing a person could do. And that she'd saved more lives than she would ever know. Today, Elena Volkov is 71 years old. She lives in Geneva. She still works occasionally as a translator. And once a year, on December 15th, she lights a candle for the millions of people who are alive because she chose treason over obedience.